What's up, everybody? I am so very pumped up about this Cooper Stuff episode because for the first time ever, we have Alisa Childers on here. Say hello, Alisa.
Hi, John. Great to be with you.
We are going to rock this thing. Do you think that at the end of this episode, we should have a duet, a Skillet / Zoe Girl duet of a song at the end of it?
Like a mashup. You know, we could do like a mashup. That'd be awesome.
I think we should do a tour where Skillet plays Zoe Girl covers and then, we flip them. What do you think?
Yeah, I love it. Let's do it.
All right, people, give us a comment and let us know which songs you want to hear on the tour we're going to do at the end of this year. But we're going to jump into awesome stuff. So let's get straight into this sweet episode of Cooper Stuff. Cooper Stuff! Hey everybody, we have an amazing podcast for you guys today with my friend Alisa Childers. She has an excellent book that I got to tell you about. It is called Another Gospel. I've read it word by word. It is so good. Go follow her on YouTube, Alisa Childers. Her podcast is fantastic. She's a Christian author and a great thinker. Has a lot of very smart things to say. You're going to love this podcast. I'm going to ask her a ton of awesome questions. As always, I want to thank everybody for supporting me in my book, Awake and Alive to Truth. Don't forget about it. It's great for groups, and it is great for anybody who wants a foundational understanding of what Christian life is all about. Anybody that feels like your life is being thrown around in absolute chaos, you got to check out my book, Awake and Alive to Truth. Only get it on johnlcooper.com, johnlcooper.com/awake. That's enough of my talking. Let's jump into this. Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome back to Cooper Stuff. As I already told you, we have a sweet guest on here. I got to promote this book. Check it out. If you can't see it here, it's Another Gospel. I got this book. I read the entire thing, Alisa. I didn't skip. I didn't skim. I read the whole book.
Wow.
And it's come out recently, right?
Yeah, it came out in October. I think the first week of October of last year. Yeah, last year.
It's really, really great. I loved it. And we're going to jump into lots of things about it. But I think I would probably encourage people of why I think this is so good. There's so many, you talk a lot about progressive Christianity in general, and I'd like to maybe talk about why. But I found this to be sort of like where I call my book like Theology for Dummies. I think this book was like Apologetics for Dummies. You talked about, is that accurate?
Yeah, I love it. That's what I wanted. I wanted to give some of these apologetic arguments and kind of thoughts, but make it, because I just remember when I was first studying apologetics, I felt so overwhelmed. I felt like such a dummy because people were using all these big words and I didn't know what they meant. So I wanted to write something that was really accessible for people who didn't already know what all the big words mean.
Well, I think you did that, and I think it's really, really needed. And so I think we'll start from the beginning here. I kind of made a joke earlier about Zoe Girl. Sorry. For people who don't know, you sung in a group called Zoe Girl.
Yeah.
And we did shows together. We did sweet shows.
Yes, we did.
So we kind of known each other for off and on, I guess, for 20 years. But
yeah.
And then you can tell whatever about your story you want to, but the book starts with this idea of you going to, I think I'd like you just to tell why you went to that particular teaching, progressive, whatever. And you can tell us whatever you want to about it. It's really important to understand your story.
Yeah, well, thanks. And yes, those were such good times touring and Shout Fest tour. And I don't know if we did a Winter Jam tour together or not, but I definitely remember the Shout Fest tour. So fun. Great times in my life. Honestly, spending the better part of a decade essentially touring around the country, trying to encourage young girls to stand strong in their faith and to be bold for Jesus on their public school campuses. And all of that was such an enormously wonderful experience for me. And so you're right. It was kind of after that was over. We were all married and having kids by that time. And so I had been invited to do some music at a local church here in Middle Tennessee. Now, I did not know that particular church was on its way to becoming progressive. So at the time, it was just marketed as your run-of-the-mill, non-denominational evangelical church, Bible Belt, all that good stuff. So we went there and I was working on some solo music. So I did that. And my husband and I just really connected with the people of this church, and especially with the pastor. We loved his intellectual approach to sermons. Neither one of us had really been exposed to that before. And we just really loved this place. And especially, and I know you relate with this, John, being a public person, touring around, a musician, there tends to be sort of this feeling you get when you go places where people have you up on this pedestal. I know you've talked about this. They have you up on this pedestal, an unrealistic pedestal. I always felt like I didn't measure up to the pedestal people had me on. And so when we went to this church, I didn't feel that from anyone. I felt they weren't judging me. I felt like they were just accepting me and loving me. They weren't thinking too highly of me. And that was very refreshing because I hadn't experienced a lot of that from church people. And so my husband and I started attending this church. And it was about 8 months into us going there that the pastor invited me to be a part of a smaller group, and he called it a study and discussion group. He compared it to seminary. He said, if you go to this group, you will come out after 4 years with this seminary level education. Now, that sounded really exciting to me because, like I mentioned, I just spent the better part of a decade touring and didn't get much time for the intellectual life. And so I was very excited. And so, I'll kind of give you the flyover and then we can drill down into any part of this that you want to. But essentially what ended up happening is that in this class, the pastor basically let us know that he was agnostic. And he called himself a hopeful agnostic. I've heard that phrase a couple times since then, but that was the first time I'd ever heard that.
And can I
And
interrupt you real quick?
yeah,
I want to ask you this. I didn't realize this from the book. So you're saying, just to make sure I'm not getting it wrong, that you were a part of the church, but he was the pastor, but he had not announced that he was a hopeful agnostic.
that's right. Yeah.
That's
So
crazy.
I know. So in this kind of more private setting, this is where he began to really lay out his real beliefs, like put his cards on the table. But on Sundays, he was still preaching kind of your
Wow.
run of the mill, orthodox, biblically sound sermons. So it's like two different people, like the midweek class guy and then the pastor guy who was like two different people. So yeah, you're right. It was very confusing because I'd been attending there for 8 months and I'd come to respect him and really come to trust him as a pastor. And so this was really rattling to hear this. And then of course, I'm thinking, well, I don't want to be judgmental. Maybe he's just being honest. And I just didn't want to judge it. So I just kind of went on. But over the course of, I lasted in the class about 4 months. And over those 4 months, I mean, John, everything that I had ever believed and really held dear about God and Jesus, and especially the Bible was under a lot of scrutiny. All of those things were kind of deconstructed. We hear stories of people talking about their deconstruction stories, almost like a sweater, and like the thread comes and they pull the thread and then the sweater unravels. I mean, that's what was happening in this class. And it was the pastor's deconstruction. And he was attempting to take us with him. And
Wow.
so I would try to debate him, but I didn't know all the stuff he knew. And so it really wasn't until we left that all of the doubts he planted really began to take root in my own heart and grow. And then I went through my own pretty dark time of doubt and even some deconstruction, although I didn't understand what was happening to me at the
Mm.
time. And so I just remember crying out to God one night. I was rocking my baby girl to sleep, and I just said, okay, God, like, this is it. If you are real, if you exist, and if Christianity is true, you have to show up somehow. You have to show me. You have to send me a lifeboat, send me somebody who can talk to me about these things, because I didn't know anybody who could answer this guy at the time.
Mm.
And so God led me to apologetics. I just began to study and I read everything I could get my hands on. And God really used apologetics to help rebuild my faith. And so the book is really that journey. It chronicles my journey of walking through those doubts and then coming back out on the other side. But it's all kind of told through this lens of looking at progressive Christianity, because that church went on years later to completely rebrand themselves. They took down the Nicene and Apostles' Creed. They put up a new belief statement they'd written, and they
Wow.
said, we are now a progressive Christian community. And so that's when I said, oh, that's what that was. And then I began to study progressive Christianity, read their books, and try to figure out, what this thing is all about and how we can answer it biblically.
That is really interesting. And I probably should have said earlier for people who haven't read the book. I mean, you are not a lightweight,
Oh,
and what I mean by that is, and obviously no disrespect at all. I said on your podcast, I find your uh, I should start by saying you have a podcast that you do in case
yeah.
people don't know. I'm sure they do. Um, Alisa Childers, and I love watching it. I think that your material is a little more academic than me. I think you're a more academic person than I am. But the reason I say not a lightweight is because it is your story, but the book is very biblically based. There's tons of Bible in the book. And what I found really helpful was tons of explanations of what you just said, which is this is what the other side was saying. This is what the deconstructionists were saying. Some of those arguments I'd not quite heard, or I had heard them, but I never really understood what they meant. And
Mm.
you kind of answered one of my questions for you. But the first thing I felt when I was reading your book was I was angry. I struggle with anger apparently, but I was kind of getting angry again. Like, why would people like this in the middle of their own deconstruction? Why do they want to lead
Mm.
people? You would think that you would want to know what you believed in order to teach people. And I just found that angering. And now I'm angered afresh to find out that he was, I wasn't sure that he was pastoring the church, but knowing that the church once was a certain way, and this was during his process. Why don't people like that stop and take a break and know who they are and then begin to teach a thing? Or do you have
Yeah.
any answers for that?
Well, so this, I actually do. I have some insight. I don't know if it's an answer, but this is one of the most common questions I'm asked when I give a talk on progressive Christianity. The first thing people will ask, especially, the first thing Christians will ask is, well, why, first of all, is there such a need to bring other people along into that deconstruction experience?
Yeah.
And why do they still want to call it Christian? Those are like the two most common questions.
That's on
And
my
so,
list too. So go
yeah,
for it.
yeah, okay. Well, I'll tackle each one. So the deconstruction part, this actually took me a while to figure out. So when I first heard the term deconstruction, I thought it just meant, uh, you know, going through all your beliefs, seeing if you think they're still true, and the ones that aren't true, you get rid of those, and you seek for truth, right? That's what I thought deconstruction was. It's actually not a good definition of
Mhm.
deconstruction. So a common definition we'll hear is that it's like the slow unraveling of someone's faith. I mentioned the sweater. There's always a sweater metaphor in deconstruction stories where they pull the thread, they keep pulling and pulling, and then the whole sweater just
Ah,
deconstructs into a ball of yarn, essentially. And so that's an okay definition. But what we have to understand is that the term deconstruction itself goes back to the 60s. So it goes back to this postmodern philosopher named Jacques Derrida. So he didn't believe that objective truth could be found through language. Now, interestingly, he used language to communicate all the things he thought were objectively true about the lack of truth existing. So there's that. But he didn't think words could be pinned down to definite and singular meanings. And so that started this whole kind of postmodern deconstructionist movement that essentially the point of it is it's based on relativism. So it's based on the idea that if objective truth exists, no one can know it, no one can apprehend it, certainly not through language or with words. And so it's actually becomes virtuous to deconstruct whatever construct of reality you were given. So
mm.
if you were raised in the evangelical church and you were told Jesus died on the cross for your sins and that he's coming again and that there's going to be this final judgment, it's actually considered a virtuous thing, a mature, enlightened thing to do to deconstruct that and then create your own sort of construct because nobody has nobody can claim to have absolute knowledge about reality. And so that's what we have to understand. It's very different from doubt, whereas doubt is actually based on truth. Doubt is when you believe something's true, then you doubt it, Okay, I want to know if that's true. I'm going to look for evidence. So doubt is actually based on truth, but deconstruction is actually based on relativism. And so
Yes.
it's an assumption of this postmodern relativistic mindset, which would say you're immature if you just stick with whatever construct you were given, because
Mm.
your parents don't know any better than anybody else what's real or true, and certainly in the area of religion. So I think that could be one of the reasons, is that deconstruction is actually viewed as a virtue, whereas, for Christians we would say, well, no, I mean, to be unsure about what you believe, no, that would be a bad thing. Like, we want to be sure, but that's because we believe in truth. And
Yes.
so it's sort of this, it's an opposite paradigm, I think. And so that's the best I've been able to get to the bottom of it, why there's such a need to deconstruct and then not just go away quietly, but build a platform around that and help other people. I mean, I have never I would tell you this, John, in the last even 3 or 4 months, I have seen so many sites pop up where people, like a therapist who, I'm a deconstruction therapist and I can walk you through your deconstruction, or Instagram pages helping you to deconstruct, because it's viewed as a good thing. This is viewed as what
Gosh.
mature people do.
It's so smart what you just said. I think you're right. Tying it back to postmodernism, it's really important that Christians, and I hope that there's some Christians watching now, that maybe you've thought about this or you've tried it. They're like, yeah, I'm kind of thinking about deconstruct. It's almost like they kind of like certain aspects of it, but not understanding the foundation of it. Because
Mhm.
for Christians who believe in objective truth, which we must, otherwise, how can there absolutely be a God? Of
Yeah.
course, it's kind of like in philosophy, the myth of neutrality.
Mhm.
There's this idea that you can come to a place where you don't have any opinions about anything, almost like you're starting over from zero. And if you believe in biblical truth, as we do, there is no neutral place. You are an enemy of God or you are a friend of God. And so the idea of breaking it all down to come to a place of zero, it's really important that Christians understand what they're getting involved with. And I think it's
Mhm.
so smart that you just tied that back to postmodernism. And now I'm horrified at what you just said about, what did you say about therapists, deconstruction
Yeah, like
therapists?
deconstruction specialists that will offer
Oh,
to help you deconstruct. But see, here's the thing that people have to realize, is that to do deconstruction the way people are doing it, you have to accept that reality is a certain
mhm.
way. You are saying, I believe it's objectively true that objective truth doesn't exist. Therefore,
Yes.
this is good. So, either way, you have to make a choice about how you think truth works. And either one is going to be a statement about objective truth. So you might as well just plant your feet into objective
Mm,
truth and try to seek what is actually true, because you're still assuming that relativism is true, which that
gosh.
refutes itself. To say truth is relative means that if you really think about that statement, all truth is relative. Well, that means that just that statement's relative, which means all truth is not relative, because at least that would be objectively true. And it refutes itself. Why not come on over and put your feet on some solid ground here?
Absolutely. No one actually wants to live that way. No one, I wrote that in my book. No one wants to be married to someone who believes in relative truth. You know what I mean? It's
Right.
like
Yeah.
you have no basis for anything. And I actually had it as one of my questions for you, which I don't need to ask because you really just said it. But one of my questions is it is important to see that postmodern um, ideas of history, even like revisionist history in we'd say in the secular world, it's all the same kind of issue. It's all the way you view the entire world. So that would lead me then to asking you a question that you just said a second ago, which is, then why do these people, and I don't want to sound too mean, these people, why do these people, but I really do mean it. Why do they have to include Jesus at all in their, I hate to call it a Christian worldview because I don't think it is a Christian worldview.
Yeah.
Why include Jesus at all? Why not just something else?
Yeah. And that's a really important question. And I think there could be a couple of different answers depending on who you talk to, because that's the one thing about progressive Christianity is that it's such a mixed bag of beliefs. You could have one progressive Christian who believes Jesus was bodily resurrected. You could have another one who doesn't. And like for you and I, that'd be a problem. We'd be like, well, wait a second. If you don't believe Jesus was bodily resurrected, then we're not on the same page. But in progressive Christianity, it's just not really about what you believe. It's about what you do. It's about what cause you're advocating for, what kind of social justice work you're doing. It's really more about that. And so there could be a couple of different streams that would answer this differently. So I would say there'd be one stream that would be your more biblically literate, theologically knowledgeable, progressive Christian, somebody like a Pete Enns or Rachel Held Evans who knows the Bible back and forth, but I believe they're twisting the scripture to mean something it doesn't actually mean. So I want to be clear about that. But they're not stupid. These people know the Bible, educated, and I would say that they would say that you and I, John, are the ones who have hijacked Christianity and made it into something it's not. And so I've heard Richard Rohr say this, that, he wants to reclaim the historic version of Christianity. And what's so ironic about that is he says he's doing that as basically he imports New Age ideas that are completely original to the New Age, bringing that into it and calling it Christian, but also claiming to say, I'm reclaiming the original version. So I think there is a stream of progressive Christian who would say, you know what, I actually believe that we are fighting for real Christianity. Now, there's another stream that's going to be more maybe your average Joe who just wants to live how they want to live. They don't want to submit to any kind of moral authority. And so they're just slapping the word Jesus on like a mascot onto whatever they think is good and true. And, if I would do this, then that's Jesus would do that. What would Jesus do? Well, it's whatever I would do, whatever I would think or feel about this certain situation, that's Jesus. And so Jesus almost in that stream becomes like a mascot for goodness or a general phrase that could just, whatever they think is good, if that makes sense.
Yes, that absolutely makes sense. The first one that you said, which is the version that they think they have the authentic Christianity and people like you are screwing it up. That is very surprising to me. I'm going to wrap my head around that for a little while.
Well, a lot of biblical scholarship is very liberal. We have of course, I'm reading currently about the Unitarian Church and that arose in the United States and New England. And then, of course, the liberal German scholarship from the late 1800s, early 1900s. They are very influenced by that liberal theology that's going to take the Bible. They're going to de-supernaturalize the Bible. They're going to view it as a wonderful work of literature, but it's not necessarily, God breathing out his word to us. And so I think that in many ways, they think that they're on the right side of who God really is, how he revealed himself in the world. You'll hear, this is what's so interesting to me. You'll hear a lot about Constantine. Let's say, well, the church went off the rails when Constantine made Christianity legal, and then you had the church wed to the state. And surely there are a bunch of problems we could talk about that happened around that time. But there's this idea that it went off the rails from there. And then what maybe evangelicals or whoever represent is more like the state and the church being wed together and that thing that went off the rails. But really, Jesus is more like this social justice warrior, this wise sage that was just all about love. And of course, what's so ironic about that is when they're teaching that, though, why then do all of their moral intuitions, all of their basic ideas about how to live in the world, why do those line up so perfectly with where culture is at? I mean, if we're the ones who are getting it wrong, why are they the ones that agree with a godless culture 99% of the time?
Yes.
That doesn't make a lot of sense.
You know what? I absolutely agree with that. I always think, isn't it ironic that it just, whatever culture's into, the progressive Christianity movement just keeps changing to agree. It never has to draw a sword. So it sounds to me like part of what you're saying, I think, and what I got out of the book that was really enlightening to me is that the progressive Christianity movement doesn't necessarily have like tenets that you have to believe. In other words, you can kind of Is it kind of like basically like a big tent party? Is it kind of like just big tent, whatever you want, you can be in?
Yeah, kind of. Yes, but no. As we both know about the nature of how tolerance works these days, it's like it'll say one thing but behave another way. And so you're right in the sense that progressive Christians largely are not creedal in the sense that they're united around a set of beliefs, although you can certainly find progressive Christian creeds on the internet, and I find them to be fairly accurate. There's like 8 points, and in my experience, I have found those to be fairly accurate. Of course, they're going to be less theological, more activism oriented, and environmentalism, things like that. But that is the tough question, because they're not essentially creedal. But this confused me when I first started studying the movement. I thought, well, if it's so hard to pin down and define, there's something that unites them. There's something that they're rallying around, saying, okay, this is why we're a movement. This is why we're calling ourselves progressive Christian. So I spent a couple years reading their books and listening to their podcasts and just trying to immerse myself in the movement to figure out if there really are any maybe core tenets. And I think I found some. I think I found some core tenets that every progressive Christian would hold to without hesitating. And if you didn't hold to these things, you wouldn't be accepted. And of course, the first thing would be, LGBT inclusion, same-sex marriage. That would be a core tenet of progressive Christianity. Another would be the view of the Bible. So if historically Christians have viewed the Bible as the word of God, even though we've argued about interpretations for 2,000 years, Christians have settled their debates using the Bible, generally speaking. And that was Jesus' view. It was the view of the earliest apostles. And yet in progressive Christianity, they don't believe that prophets were speaking for God in the Old Testament. So when we read that Moses says, God is commanding us to go in and do X, Y, Z, the progressive Christian can analyze that and say, well, that's just what Moses believed, or what the people of Israel believed about God in their times and places, but that's not really God speaking. So you can see, if you extrapolate that to the New Testament, that's why in progressive Christianity, you can disagree with Paul. You can say, well, Paul had these biases and prejudices, therefore I don't have to listen to what he said about women or about sexuality or whatever. So there's this very different view of the Bible. Like, you would not be able to walk into a progressive church and start saying the Bible is the word of God, we have to obey it. You would get laughed out the doors. And so that would be another one. The cross is a big one. So the idea that Jesus died on the cross for our sins, this is viewed as cosmic child abuse. That is a very popular phrase in progressive Christianity. So they're going to deny at least the substitutionary atonement of Jesus. Now, they might affirm some of the other metaphors that we all would affirm, like Christus Victor and things like that. But the idea that Jesus, in any meaningful sense, was a sacrifice to God, to reconcile us to God, sinful humanity to a holy God, that is off the table in progressive Christianity. And so their gospel then becomes, like I said before, very activist oriented, very much about the here and the now, the environmental causes you're advocating for, the social justice causes you're advocating for, which is why you see a lot of that stuff in their if they do have creeds.
Yes. That I'm going to read a quote from your book about what you said. So it's cool that I had this ready and you just touched on it. So I'm going to read this because everybody needs to go and get this book. This is really good. I wish I wrote this. Maybe I did. I'll steal it. All right, check it out. Progressive Christians assume they are painting God in a more tolerant light by denying the substitutionary atonement of Jesus. But in reality, they are simply constructing a codependent and impotent God who is powerless to stop evil. That God is not really good. That God is not the God of the Bible. That God cannot save you. That's kind of what you're talking about now. You have to redefine a bunch of terms, which again is actually a core tenet of postmodernism too, right? You are changing the world through language. You are creating revolution through language and changing words. And one of the things that also made me mad in your book was when you get to a place where you say that you had a phone call with your pastor that was teaching this class, and he kept saying, anything you want to ask, just ask. And on the phone call, you asked him if he thought the Bible was inspired. And he said, yes, the Bible is inspired. But then he changed his view later. And basically he had a different definition for the word inspired. And I thought you might I talk about language from a political philosophy standpoint, how we saw that in communism and this, that, and the other. Knowing that it happens in Christianity, to bastardize the gospel makes me so mad. And do you want to talk about that particular thing real fast?
Yes, because you're so right. It's like, in fact, in the Mama Bear Apologetics book, we call this, Hillary Ferrer coined this term for the Mama Bear book called linguistic theft. So essentially they're stealing words, changing the definitions and then weaponizing them, essentially. And so we do see that so often in progressive Christianity. I mean, this is what we see in other cults, right? This is, people will say, oh, yes, I believe in the Trinity, but what they actually mean are 3 different gods. And they don't really mean Trinity in the same way that we meant, maybe with Mormonism or whatever. And so progressive Christianity, in progressive Christianity, they do the same thing. And I learned this the hard way because, as you mentioned, I was becoming uncomfortable with the class. And I remember the pastor saying, look, if you're uncomfortable, you can ask me any point blank question that you want to, and I will answer you honestly. And so I asked him that, is the Bible divinely inspired? And he said, yes, absolutely. Like there wasn't even a hesitation. There were no qualifiers, no disclaimers. And then weeks later, maybe a couple months later, we're talking about the Bible in class, and he's starting to talk about the Bible as if it's not inspired. And I remember kind of stopping the class and saying, well, wait a second, you told me that you believe the Bible is divinely inspired. In fact, that was the phrase I used, divinely inspired. And he kind of hesitated. I remember it was like this weird moment where he was like, okay, like the wheels were turning. How am I gonna wiggle out of this? And he said, actually, I do believe the Bible is divinely inspired, but it's inspired in the same way an A.W. Tozer book is inspired, or C.S. Lewis, and then he even said, or one of my sermons on Sunday. And so the implication was that God, how God might take something and inspire you with it. It might make it inspiring to you. He was trying to act like that's what he meant from the first question. But I know he knew what I meant when I said, do you believe the Bible is divinely inspired? I did not mean like a sermon on Sunday. That's not, and I think he knew that, but there's this bait and switch with language we see all the time.
I find that so frustrating. It's a language. You see this in communist revolutions, and you see it and as you said, the critical theory studies and whatnot. They use language not to clarify, but to obfuscate.
Yes.
It's the intent of it is I can confuse you with something in order to lessen the blow for later when you actually know what I'm talking about. And the fact that people do this with Christianity upsets me. I got so many questions for you. All right, now. I want to ask you this, and I got like 500 questions, so I'm just going to keep blasting if you're okay.
Do it.
So, now it's forget my ADD kicked in. I want to ask you this. So, a lot of people say, let's stop creating divisions in the kingdom of God. You know what I mean? Like Calvinists and Arminius, and we go to war over these things. Cessationists and continuationists. We might talk about things like that. I'm into like unity in the faith, on the things that we must unify on and whatnot. This is the problem with true progressive Christianity. You already touched on it. Will you tell us why it's important that Jesus was the atonement for our sins? In other words, why can't he just be a nice guy that died on a cross, or a picture of God's love for you? I think I read in your book that maybe someone had said, well, that was just, I think if I remember right, you said something like that was his way. In other words, Jesus died because people were really mean. It was, as opposed to anything else. And I guess what I'm asking you, I mean, I know the answer, but I'd like for you to say it, why that's different than me and you disagreeing on eschatology.
Yeah, thank you for that. That's a great question. So this has to do with how Christians will classify different beliefs. So you'll hear people say, primary beliefs or essential beliefs or non-negotiables. That's one category. And then there's a broader category of what you might hear, tertiary issues or second tier issues, secondary doctrines. Now, secondary doctrines are not unimportant. I have strong beliefs about a lot of these things. But I classify as essential a belief or a teaching that will directly affect your salvation. So I didn't think of this. There's another apologist who said this, but I think it's really well put. If we can argue about it once we're all in heaven, then it's a secondary issue. Right.
Yeah.
If we're all going to get there and then we can argue about it.
Yeah.
So those essential beliefs, and this is why I think you feel that anger, because this is people's souls. This is salvation. This is the message of salvation. And so the cross is right in the heart of that. And it's not just like we're plucking this one thing out of the middle of the Bible. You look from the beginning, from creation, you have Adam and Eve choosing to rebel against God, introducing sin, unleashing evil into the world, essentially, by their rebellion against God. Well, of course, at the same time, we know that God is holy, which means he can't have unity with sin. Well, now we have a problem because there's a separation here. We're sinful. God cannot have unity with sin. And so the cross was his solution. This is his rescue plan, essentially. And, we mentioned cosmic child abuse, which is just it's so confusing to understand why somebody would view it that way. The only thing I can think of is if they just don't really have a deep understanding of the Trinity, because it's not like you have this mean bully father who just needs somebody to be punished, like grab some hapless victim. What you have is God, love itself, saying, okay, justice requires sin to be paid for. And by the way, justice isn't some kind of outside standard that God has to reach up to or meet. He is justice. That's his nature, his character.
Woo,
So,
I
and
love
that's,
that.
well, it's because that's what they'll present it that way in progressive Christianity. Like they'll straw man our view by saying, oh, we think God has to appeal to some outside standard of justice. No, he is justice. It's the very definition of who he is. It's one of his attributes. Yes. And so justice requires payment for sin. He gets to make those rules, not us. And so instead of pulling out a hapless victim, he says, no, I'll do it. And that's when you have the incarnation, God become flesh. Jesus said, no one takes my life from me. I lay it down willingly. He had authority to do that by the Father. He could have said, no, I don't want to do it, or yes, I do want to do it. And he chose to do that. I mean, from before the incarnation. And so you have God himself becoming the solution and taking our sins upon himself so that those who want him can have him and have that unity restored. And for those of us who I suppose know we're sinners, we see how beautiful that is. But this whole idea of cosmic child abuse is very destructive to the gospel. It obliterates the gospel. And you're right. A lot of times you'll hear them say, well, Jesus submitted to our bloodlust. Like we wanted our pound of flesh. So he said, okay, I'll give it to you. But, it's really interesting. I mentioned that view to William Lane Craig, who has recently just done a tremendous amount of work on the atonement and just theological work. And he said, what kind of a monstrous deity would do that? Would just say, oh, you want to kill me? Okay, I'll let you kill me. Right. I mean, that's insanity. And so, you want to talk about cosmic child abuse or cosmic abuse, like that, their view is more of the cosmic abusive view. And so ultimately the cross, the reason it's such a core issue is this is how God keeps his promise to wipe away every tear from our eye. Because if he doesn't solve the sin problem, then heaven will just be another version of hell, because sin will have to come in with everybody who's a sinner. And so it's a beautiful doctrine of him keeping his promise to wipe away every tear from our eye. There'll be no more sadness, crying, pain. Sin will be done. And it's a beautiful doctrine if people first can realize that they need it. And I think that's where the problem lies.
Excellent. Oh, that is so excellent. I love the distinction you made it in the book as well, that we did not take Jesus's life, he gave it. And the fact that salvation and Jesus's death and burial and resurrection and the atonement, all of this is God's idea. This isn't our idea. It originated with God. And I want to read a quote that I really liked, and then I got a question for you. Another quote from the book. This is so good. You were talking about the atonement, and you were talking about the wrath of God. And I want to ask you a question about that. I think you did a great job in this chapter. It says, simply put, without the wrath of God towards sin, heaven would be full of hell. Woo, that's good. That's Puritan. That's Puritan level there. There's a book I think the absolute best book I've ever read, in my view, of holiness is called it's called Holiness by Jc
Jc
Ryle.
Ryle,
Yeah, it's a good one,
absolutely.
right?
The OG on
Oh,
holiness there. Absolutely.
I'm so glad. Yeah, this reminded me of that. And in that book, he talks about something that I thought you talked about that was good. I'd like to get you to talk. But he was basically saying that in sanctification, that we're not just forgiven, we are sanctified, right? We are made holy, but we are being made holy. And he was basically saying without sanctification, then you wouldn't even enjoy heaven. We have to be made holy in order to enjoy heaven. Otherwise, you're in a place where you are around things you do not love, because without sanctification, you love the world and you are an enemy of God, which means you love unrighteousness. And I felt that you, in a certain way, talked about that because you were talking about hell. Your chapter on hell was fantastic. And I thought you might want to talk about that, explain that a little bit. I think that you said something like people that are separated from God for eternity. You talked about gnashing of teeth. Do you want to maybe? I thought it
Yeah.
was so good. You might want to, break
Yeah.
out on
Well,
that.
thank you. So, I'm a child of the 80s and 90s. So my theology on hell was largely shaped by church plays and, the kind of, there was a lot of that in the 80s and 90s. It seems like these,
Striper, please tell me
yeah, yes,
Striper.
well, no, but I do love To Hell with the Devil. It's
Yes,
actually a really theologically good concept,
it
actually,
is. Yeah,
because
it's
the
so good.
devil or hell was actually created for the devil. But no, I love Striper and all that. But just like these traveling church plays that they just had some bad theology. And so I start the chapter talking about trying to get my friends saved, and we go to the traveling church play about hell. And the devil emerges from his fiery pit, like he's in charge of the place, right? Like he's just the king of hell. He's having a blast. He gets to drag all the people to hell. And I think I had a lot of misconceptions about hell, probably because of some of that, and also some of the media that was real popular back then. It was just, I don't know if like culture was fixated on hell and the devil and all that. I don't know, but it was just the moment I grew up in. And so I had a lot of these misconceptions about hell. And one of them had to do with gnashing of teeth. I think I always thought that when we read about people gnashing their teeth in hell in the Bible, what I pictured was these really super repentant, like, oh, I'm so sorry, and the teeth gnashes, and oh, I just wish, or maybe they didn't have a chance to hear the gospel, which again was a theme in those traveling church plays. Like the person gets drugged to hell. It's like, I never got to hear the gospel. I would have
Right.
responded to it and gnashing the teeth. So almost like it's this repentant posture. But then I really began to study every time in the Bible that phrase is used. It's always used as a like a from something you do at an enemy, somebody you hate, somebody that you have this just indignation for and this hatred for. You're gnashing your teeth at them. And then as I began
Yeah, I
to,
believe, if I remember right, I think that when Stephen the martyr, I think one translation says that the
yes.
people stoning him were gnashing their teeth at him, if I
Yes, they
remember.
were. They gnashed their teeth because they hated what he was standing for. They hated what he was saying. And I mean, they're getting ready to kill him. They hate this
Mm.
guy. So this is a posture you take toward an enemy. And so and as I began to study just the theology of hell, I realized I had some misconceptions about it. Because it was hard for me to reconcile God being fair and just with, some of these caricatures that I learned from plays and TV and whatever. And so yeah, the gnashing of the teeth was a big one, because I think it was C.S. Lewis who said the gates of hell are locked on the inside. And I think
Mm.
you made a good point. It's like people don't, if people don't want God in this life, what makes us think that they're going to want to spend eternity with him?
Mm.
Because we all know what it's like to love your sin for a season. Sin
Mm.
is fun for a season. The Bible says that. But it's like a drug. It's like it feels good when you take it, but it's going to kill you. It slowly
Mm.
kills you. It entraps you. It imprisons you. You hate it. Uh, and so, but there are people who want to stay in a state like that. And so it's kind of like there is some validity to viewing hell being the kind of thing where it is the consequences of our actions in this life. But where progressive Christians don't take it far enough is they'll deny that it's an actual place, an eternal destination. That's something they would deny. But in many ways, I think C.S. Lewis may be right. I think if people don't want him in this life, they wouldn't want him in the next. And I've heard, I think Frank Turek say, God's a gentleman. He's not going to force somebody into his presence for eternity if they don't want to be with him. And so that's why, this process of sanctification, everybody's, at a different place in their process of sanctification. I think it was, Charles Ryrie, not Ryle, but Ryrie, who said sanctification is like God shows you light, you respond to that light, then he shows you more light. And this is a lifetime process of responding to the light God gives you, because ultimately he created us and he knows what will make us the most ultimately filled with peace and joy and true happiness. If we live according to our purpose, which is to glorify him and enjoy him forever and worship him. And sometimes we in our rebellion think, no, I want to do this instead. And so I think God gives everybody ultimately what they want in the end. And so in the chapter, I do believe that hell is eternal. I believe that souls are conscious, and I believe it's torment. And so that's the view I took in the book. I think that's what the Bible teaches. I think that's the historic view of the church. There are people with different views on that, but you mentioned the difference between eschatology, let's say, where we could disagree. I might be premillennial, you might be amillennial, or something like that. And we can agree to disagree on that because the Bible's more vague on that. I mean, anybody read Revelation, tell me you got it figured out. Great, call me, because I want to talk to you if you think you know what Revelation's all about. But the things that are really clear, things like the cross, things that the existence of hell, like hell is a real place. It's not just the bad choices we make on earth. I mean, the Bible is very clear about that. So even if people take a different view of the nature of hell, I think to deny that hell exists, that's one of those cores, because then you have, again, how do we solve the sin problem? It affects all the major points of the gospel.
Yeah, I agree. It does. I think I might turn subject slightly. Another thing you had in the book that I liked was you were saying that a lot of these, I think it's okay that we call them heresies. I believe they're heresies, and you do too, it sounds like, that they are not new. And I just want to tell people watching me, we probably won't get into all of them, but you do a good job of listing out ancient heresies that are popping up in different ways. And one of those, I view as that we're finding salvation through works. And in a certain way, progressive Christianity is saying it's not about what you believe about Christ, whether he really died or he really rose from the dead, or whether that's a picture. It doesn't matter. We're progressing towards basically, you just need to live the right way and feed the poor and so on and so forth. And I kind of see that as basically salvation through works. Am I reading that kind of correctly?
I think that's exactly what it is. And this mirrors arguably the earliest heresy. So, I think sometimes we think in our modern context, like, oh my gosh, we have to call out false teachings and all this, this is yucky. But this is what Christians have had to do for 2,000 years, going back to the first generation of Christians. We're talking Peter and Paul. They dealt with this, what was called the circumcision party, or sometimes referred to as the Judaizers. And again, these were probably very well-meaning people. It's not like they were like, oh, I want to infiltrate and, bring my heresy. That's the thing we have to realize is a lot of times, people who bring in these false ideas are very sincere. They truly believe these things. And so there was this, the Judaizers, or the circumcision party. They were a group of Jews that were basically telling Gentile Christians that you couldn't call yourself a real Christian until you basically converted to Judaism first. So for a grown man who just became a Christian, that would mean he'd have to go become circumcised. And so they were teaching that Gentile Christians had to become Jews first, essentially, before they could accept the Jewish Messiah. And Paul was saying, no, I mean, this was Paul's big message. his gospel was to the Gentiles, and he's saying, no, you don't have. In fact, he got so frustrated at one point, he says, I wish they would go circumcise themselves, essentially. He just gets so frustrated. And so there were, even Peter, when the Judaizers were around, like, he capitulated to them because he was intimidated by them. And that's when Paul opposed him to his face. So there's always been this kind of stuff we have to deal with. But yes, this was works. They were adding works to the gospel, the free gift of salvation that Jesus gave. They were saying, no, it's not enough. There's some things you have to do before you can accept the gospel. And I think that almost every false teaching or heretical gospel has mirrored that in some way, because it's an easy thing to sell people. Like, we want to be told what to do. What do I have to do? And
right.
we like that. We actually don't like grace. Grace is this unmerited favor. You don't deserve this, but it's a free gift that God gives you anyway. In fact, you deserve to be punished. You deserve death. But Jesus says, okay, it doesn't matter. I'm just going to give you this free gift. Like, we don't like that. We want a job. Give me a job to do, And so I think we're inclined to buy these heresies. But yeah, that was the first one really that we read about.
That's funny. Well, I think that makes sense, that why a lot of the progressive Christian movement also becomes social justice warrior oriented. Mm-hmm. But I kind of want to make a distinction to try to be gracious. So you have your progressive Christianity, like what we're talking about, that I consider to be not actual Christianity. And I would agree with the title of the book. That's kind of a different gospel. That's social justice oriented for works. Then there's another group of Christians, and I certainly don't want to put words in your mouth. This is just me thinking out loud. I talk not so much about the first group, which is what your book is about. A lot of what I deal with is in the second group of people who are Christians and also social justice warrior oriented. Mm-hmm. But some of that social justice, in my view, has kind of become idolatrous, like the goal is social justice. And I guess what I wanted to get at, I made a connection in reading this book. I don't know if I'm crazy, but you wrote about in the early 2000s, you had it's the Emergent Movement. That's what they called it, right?
Yeah.
So you had the Emergent Movement, and that I never heard of that until 2010, probably with Rob Bell with Love Wins.
Love Wins.
All right, that's when I heard of that. I was like, what is this? This is crazy. And apparently it'd been going for a while. So follow me on this and you tell me if you know what I'm trying to get at. Sometimes in my brain. So you had the Emergent Movement starting. Then you had the people in the middle. I call them the bridge builders that were trying to acknowledge, all right, the church does have some problems, meaning maybe the church hasn't always been as relevant as we could. Maybe we've been kind of mean. Maybe we did too many heaven and hell plays, and maybe we didn't help people with their questions, or maybe we didn't give them a place in church to ask the hard questions. I think you mentioned that in your book too. Like, there are a lot of Christians I know that have deconstructed that said, well, I always had real questions about, hell or this, and nobody would listen to my questions. So you have these people in the middle on the Emergent Movement that said, I don't agree with the Emergent Movement. I don't agree with their theology, but they're right in noticing we're missing something. So you had the people in the middle that became we need to be relevant people. And then you had the other group, which tended to be more fundamentalist oriented, which was very angry, not only at the Emergent Movement, but mad at the people in the middle because they were warning you people. I don't want to put words in John MacArthur's mouth, but it could be someone like you could imagine a John MacArthur type saying, you people in the middle are not calling out what needs to be called out, and it will lead to a bad place. And I would tend to agree. It has led to a bad place.
Yeah.
I kind of see the modern social justice movement a little like that too. I see the far extremes of it, which I would consider to almost be not Christianity, which is salvation through social justice. But then we have the middle bilge builders. I don't even know what word I just said.
I like it.
Thank you. Yeah, bridge builders. And I do think they're saying, hey, we do need to recognize that the church hasn't always done what she should have done with racism, with fill in the blank, with the poor. I don't know, fill in the blank. I guess what I'm trying to say is there is a little bit of a connection. Am I right to make some sort of connection with the social justice warrior thing, or am I off a little bit?
Oh, I think that, okay, I want to be really careful how I word this.
Yeah, I'm sorry if I'm getting you into bad water.
No,
So be
no, not
as
at all. No,
careful
I
as
talk
you want to
about
be.
this. No, I talk about this a lot on my podcast. But I just want to be careful to define what I'm talking about. I'm gonna use the phrase secular social justice, okay?
Good.
Because true biblical justice is one thing, and then how the world is defining social justice is entirely a different thing.
Mm.
And so often I think Christians will just talk past each other because we'll be saying, well, I believe in social justice. Oh, you do? Well, you're a heretic. And they're like, well, what's wrong with feeding the poor? And then it's like nobody's understanding each other. But I think you are making a point that is extremely important. And I think that right now in 2021, secular social justice is the biggest threat to the church right now.
Yes,
And
I agree with that.
the reason I say this is because I saw this in the progressive movement. I saw this for years in the progressive movement, how it shifted from sin and redemption to social justice. And even in the past 2 years, especially, it's just ramped up like crazy in the progressive movement, where it has, I mean, critical theory language has all but completely replaced their gospel. At the same time, I'm seeing, like you say, the bridge builders, the Christians who on paper have all of the theological boxes checked. They believe in the atonement. They believe in the second coming of Jesus. They believe in the physical resurrection. And at the same time, they seem to be spouting a lot of the same ideologies and teachings that secular social justice does. The people who are preaching biblical justice are being called names, even among some of these, what you might call bridge builders. And I think it's like utmost importance. I don't know how the drift will go. I don't know if, this middle road that seems to be kind of have a foot in both, if they'll, come back to orthodoxy and realize, oh my gosh, we have misdefined justice. We've gotten it wrong. We apologize. We want to always be on God's side on these things. Or if they'll continue to drift, and then they won't be able to check, because they won't. If they continue to preach secular social justice, they are not going to be able to check to maintain the core tenets of the gospel, because they're opposed to each other. I mean, look at critical theory. It pits people against each other as far as their race and ethnicity and gender and all of these things. I'm not supposed to see you as, now listen, I'm not an academic, and I realize I'm not using academic language, but I'm talking about, this is what boots on the ground it does to people. It
Yes.
causes people to look at each other, not like my brother in Christ, John, but, oh, John's a white guy. That means he doesn't have access to truth on certain things, and I don't need to listen to him on certain things. And that is extremely dangerous, because as Christians, we know that the Bible is our authority, and we go to the Bible for truth. And whether it's a white man or a black woman or whoever, true, if they're speaking biblical truth, they're speaking biblical truth regardless of their ethnic background or their gender or any of that. And so I think it's extremely, I think it's the biggest threat to the church right now. And I think you're absolutely right about that.
I agree with that. I absolutely think I'm glad you call it secular social justice. I think that's a great name for it. And I also think that secular social justice in the church, even in Orthodox, Christianity, or you call it historic Christianity, which is a good name for it. Once you let secular social justice into it, I see it as a bridge to progressive Christianity, because, as you said, the nature of biblical justice has to come from biblical law, right? You can't separate justice and law in any ideology, right? It comes from biblical law, but the secular social justice comes from secular humanism, basically.
Yeah.
I would say, really, right? Self and whatever
Yeah.
your God, whatever this humanistic God is, that's where it comes from.
Yeah.
And so I don't think that it's too alarmist. I'm really glad to know that you agree. I don't think it's too alarmist for us to say, look, I'm not trying to start kicking people out of the church.
Yeah.
I'm not looking to start saying you're out of the church, but to raise the alarm that, hey, these things actually are kind of quite dangerous, because they are kind of leading to a path. And I see I see that in progressive Christianity, how it changes the nature of atonement, which we've already discussed. And I see that in liberation theology too. Liberation theology also changes the nature of atonement. It comes into power dynamics and how, Jesus gave up power and this, that, and the other. And there are some Christians that I think they think we're being nice by not bringing up, don't divide us, don't bring it up. But I'm a little bit like, I think we need to be warned, because you will end up skewing outside of historic Christianity. And
Well, we
I
have
think
to
that's
talk
dangerous.
about it. We have to talk about it because my friend Monique Duson, she founded the Center for Biblical Unity, and so she is really boots on the ground trying to sound the alarm on this stuff in the church, and she regularly receives emails from. I mean, this stuff is tearing families apart. It's tearing churches apart. I mean, this is not just a little idea that one person might have and the other person might disagree, and haha, okay, we're fine. This is tearing people apart,
Oh,
and it is the most disunifying type of ideology. It pits people against each other, like we talked about before. Truth claims are viewed as power plays. I mean, it's absolutely destructive, and it's corrosive to the gospel. And I think you're right. I think this is something that we have to talk about. And now, with that said, there are a lot of misunderstandings. Like I will see somebody write something that's very nuanced. Of course, often, nuance can be a whole other thing, but like they're trying to parse things out, and I'm trying to give them some rope, going, look, you've been a faithful Bible teacher for 20 years. I'm going to give you a long rope on this. I think there's some problematic things you're saying, and I'm praying for those people, and I pray that they'll wake up and see how destructive this is. But then you have this other group that's very loud, very vocal, very much like the church needs to get on board with this. And I think you're right. It's like this need to be relevant, or this need to say, no, we're justice people too. But
yes.
God's justice is never going to resonate with the world,
Mm.
and that's where I think people don't understand. That's why I was so careful to define social justice, because I think a lot of Christians, they hear that phrase and they think, well, social justice is great. I mean, it's feeding the poor, it's taking care of the homeless, it's
Right.
going to do prison ministry. That is not what the secular world defines as social justice.
Yes.
It's not enough to do that. You have to dismantle any kind of systems that have the power, and that's just a recipe for anarchy and disaster, I think.
Mm. I I absolutely agree. It's such an important thing to note that biblical justice is not that's something the world's like going to love. I mean, it's not like they all love Jesus. And
Yeah.
I think you're right. I think biblical justice and secular, or I've heard it called ideological social justice, but those are different things. I think as we end up, you said another phrase that I liked. I think you called it boots on the ground, and I like that because when I first started doing Cooper stuff, I think I kept just thinking, why am I doing this? I'm not near as smart as other people. And what I'm thankful about with your podcast and the book, and I really can't recommend it enough, is that even though I think that your thing is more, I would call it intellectual than what I do, it's really important because you have your. This is what I've noticed the world does better than Christians do. Here's what I'm going to say: the world does a good job of having boots on the ground people, right?
Hmm.
Because they have it in musicians and actors, right?
Hmm.
Hollywood is boots on the
Yeah.
ground. They're not the smartest people in the world, but they go out there and they just pound culture.
Hmm.
And in Christianity, we tend to have it the really really smart people, and they do all of that stuff, and we go, hey, I'm not smart enough to say anything. Christianity needs boots on the ground folks
Yeah.
as well that could write a book like this. So I'm going to tell uh, people watching again, this book is really good. It is called Another Gospel, Alisa Childers. It's boots on the ground for apologetics. If you don't have a degree, you don't need a degree. It explains it really well. So as we end up, what do we need to do in order to save people from this whole deconstructing thing? What do we need to do?
Wow. Just a little question, right?
That's easy.
Just yeah, what do we do? Um, so wow, that is a big question. Well, I think that probably a good first step is kind of where we started. It's to understand why people are so attracted to it. Because I think the thing Christians need to realize about progressive Christianity is that this isn't a worldview that atheists are regularly converting to progressive Christianity, or Hindus are hearing the message of progressive Christianity and saying, that sounds right, I'm going to convert to that. This is, I would say, 99% of progressive Christians are deconverted evangelicals.
Yes,
So
that's a really
these,
good point.
yeah, so these are people who they're actually walking away from something more than they're walking to something. And I think that's why there's such a mixed bag of views in progressive Christianity, because it's a movement of people that are primarily identified by what they're rejecting, not by what they're
Yes.
accepting. And so there are reasons for this. And this is where, the church, we need to sort of look at some of this. We're seeing abuse scandals come to light where people have been legitimately abused by celebrity Christians or high profile pastors. And I can understand where they just want nothing to do with whatever it was that they grew up with, And so I think some understanding as to why people are attracted to the movement is a good first step to start from a place of compassion and knowing that, often they're not rejecting the real gospel. I will say something that I haven't ever said publicly, but I think it's true. And I want to be careful I word it because I do think it's true. I don't think I have ever heard a deconstruction story and I've listened to a lot of them, or a story from somebody who converted to progressive Christianity who characterized the gospel correctly even one time.
Right.
It's always a caricature in one way or another, or they were culturally Christians where they speak the lingo, they understand it. They maybe thought they were Christians because their parents were. But I haven't heard one gospel presentation from a deconstructed person where I was like, that is the exact gospel. And so I think we have to understand that we're talking about people that don't find beauty in the gospel. They probably don't know the real gospel. They don't understand the real gospel. And I realize like somebody might hear that and get really mad and say, well, that's not fair. I understand the gospel. Maybe you do. I'm just saying that in the deconstruction stories I hear, I'm not hearing it. And so I think a large amount of people going into progressive Christianity were given some kind of a caricature, not the real thing. And so I think that as Christians, we need to live out the real thing with joy and with the hope that lies within us, give reasons for the hope that lies within us, as the Bible tells us to do. But to start from that place of compassion, because there are reasons people are going to progressive Christianity. And it's not always just rebellion. Sometimes it is. Sometimes it's just, I want to live how I want to live, and I'm tired of this. And there's a lot of that. But I think that there are some deep wounds in a lot of people that got so tangled up with the gospel that they weren't able to disconnect it. So just throw the whole thing out. And so maybe starting from a place of compassion could be a good first step. But it's a long haul. I mean, with the relationships and things, it's going to be a long haul that requires a lot of patience, well-placed questions. Always recommend Greg Kokel's book, Tactics, to help people have better conversations with stuff like this. But yeah, ultimately that'd be a good starting place.
That is an excellent answer. I love that. I agree. I think that some people are claiming that they have these, impossible questions that no one could answer, and then in Christianity we are afraid to go into them because what we're going to find is going to be ugly. But I have found in my life, the more I understand the Bible, the more beautiful the gospel is. The more I understand the Bible, I'm like, oh, that answers that question too. It's so fulfilling to know the word of God. So I think that is a perfect way to answer that. Thank you so much for coming on Cooper Stuff. It's just been a real thrill chatting with you. And I hope this really helps a lot of people and encourages a lot of people in their faith.
Well, I hope so too. And I hope that your listeners will come over and watch your guest appearance on my podcast, which I told you before is you are my most popular guest ever on my podcast. So people loved it. They loved it. So thanks so much for having me. It was fun.
I loved it. Thanks. Everybody out there, keep rocking. Thanks for watching Cooper Stuff. Cooper Stuff! Read the Bible. Every time I'm just asking the Lord the whole time, please let this save. It's like my worst nightmare is that I record someone and it doesn't save. We're recording.
All right.